So welcome back one more time with comrade Professor Bruno Drweski, and in the last year, all the time we are celebrating 100th anniversary of something, 100th anniversary of February Revolution, after 100th anniversary of October Revolution. After that was the 100th anniversary of creation of the Polish Communist Party, French section of International Communist. So it is 100th anniversary of French Communist Party, and now we are celebrating 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. It is the biggest party communist which existed in history, and
yeah.
I am listening you. I'm listening you.
Okay, so of course, this party, as you told, is the most important communist party in the history because of his mass character. We have to take into account that now Communist Party of China has 92 million members, but when it started, it had only 70 members. So we have to take into account that this party was a little tiny group in 1921, and this group managed to become the largest communist party in the world. And this fact in itself is a very interesting fact. Also, the fact that the Communist Party of China has a very, I would say, peculiar history, because it created something very new, of course, on the base of the October Revolution, on the construction of socialism in Soviet Union, but with very strong specifics due to the Chinese situation we have to take into account. The second thing we have also to take into account is that the Communist Party in China was formed in a country already in revolution, because not going back to the first attempts to make revolution in China, we have of course to take into account the fact that in 1911, just before the First World War, the revolution in China succeeded in creating a republic. Of course, a republic which was not very successful at the very beginning. But anyway, the monarchy, the empire, was for the first time in the Chinese history abolished, and the idea of a republic was taken into account. So we have to take into account the fact that the Communist Party arrived in a country already in revolution, with a strong civil war resulting from this revolution, and that the Russian Revolution of 1917 had a huge impact on Chinese revolutionaries, because already we had revolutionaries in China, and a huge impact due to the fact that Russia was an imperialist country which take advantage of its imperialist position in common with other imperialist powers, Western imperialist powers in China. And one of the first decisions of the Soviet government, of the Russian Soviet government, was to abolish all the unequal treaties against China. So the decision made by the Soviet government created for the first time in China the impression that Chinese are not alone in the world, that one of its main neighbor and, of course, power can now help Chinese people to get liberated. And that's why communism was very popular, and that the, let's say, the leader and the symbol of the Chinese Revolution, of the 1911 Chinese Revolution, Sun Yat-sen, who was not communist, but was strongly, let's say, left patriot, anti-colonialists, decided that Soviet Union, Soviet government is an ally for the Chinese revolutionary process. So the communists, when they created the party in China in 1921, created a party which was, let's say, the vanguard of a much broader movement tending to fight colonialism and tending to associate China with Soviet Russia, and creating a party along the Communist Party, the Kuomintang, or the National Party, sometimes we translated by Nationalist Party, which was, of course, a very heterogeneous party, but in which, at the very beginning at least, under Sun Yat-sen, the functioning of the Kuomintang was quite the same as the functioning of the Communist Party. It means the Kuomintang was a disciplined party with democratic centralism, or supposedly with democratic centralism, and up to 1927, Kuomintang and communists were allied. In 1927, after the death of Sun Yat-sen, then we had the Chiang Kai-shek coup, and Chiang Kai-shek was representing the right wing of the Kuomintang, and then we had the split and the massacre of communists in 1927. But we have to take into account that for the first years of its existence, the Chinese Communist Party was part of a broader movement, of a broader revolutionary movement that begins before, just one moment, that begins before the Russian Revolution, and that was carried on later, partly by communists, and more, as we know later, by communists. That's the first thing. As I told you, the Communist Party was a very tiny party at the very beginning, but it grew very quickly. And it grew especially in towns at the beginning, in towns and among the working class. And that will create some problems later because, of course, Marxist ideology is fit to working class and workers, but we have to take into account the fact that China was a strongly backward country, and that industry was and towns were relatively unimportant in this massive agricultural and peasant country. So the fact that the communists were were quite strong in cities like Canton, Shanghai especially, was locally, I would say, very important, was important in the competition for political power at the beginning, but on the other side, it didn't had a strong influence over the whole country. And this situation will clearly appear after the 1927, when the Chiang Kai-shek government decided to literally to massacre communists, and the fact that they were isolated in cities made the repression very effective, and we can say that the Communist Party almost disappeared. And now when I think about the Communist Party, I have to take into account the fact that we will have a lot of leaders of the Communist Party, and we have to take into account the fact that Mao Zedong became the president of the Communist Party only in 1943. We can say he was the main leader of the Communist Party from 1935 during the so-called Sunni Conference, but up to 1935, the Communist Party was chaired by people from a completely different background, than Mao Zedong. So now when we think about Chinese Communist Party, we always talk about Mao Zedong as if he was the founder of the party. In fact, Mao Zedong was member of the party from the very beginning, but he was not the main leader up to 1935 and especially 1943. So we have to understand what happened in the meantime at the very beginning of the history of the party. So we have to take into account first that the first leader, the first general secretary of the party, which is called Sen Tu-Xiu, was very linked with the Soviet party, with the Soviet line. But he disagreed with the idea that communists should cooperate strongly with the Kuomintang, which was the idea that the Soviet Union and the Comintern was pushing. And after the disaster of 1927, when Chiang Kai-shek took power and exterminated a lot of communists, Chen Tu-Xiu, so the first leader of the Communist Party, became quite anti-Soviet, and even in 1929 he took side of Drweski and Trotskyism, and of course he was then expelled from the Communist Party of China. And at that time, we had a new direction of different leaders. Maybe it's not useful, I would tell you all leaders the Communist Party had between 1927 and 1943. But we have to take into account that all these leaders were linked with what is called the 28 Bolsheviks. The 28 Bolsheviks were communists who were sent to Soviet Union in 1925, and they were formed at the school, the Comintern school in Moscow, and then, of course, sent back to China to, let's say, to build a Soviet-type communist party. And it's important to tell that because, as I told you, Chinese Communist Party appeared, of course, under the influence of the Russian Revolution, but it was a party that appeared in a country already under revolution from 1911. And in the Chinese Revolution before the communists, we had a very strong first. It's one. I would say it's a very forgotten first step of Chinese Revolution in the middle of the 19th century. We had in China the so-called Taiping Uprising, which was, let's say, neo-Christian uprising, which is very, very strange in a country which had no Christian roots. We had the leader of the Taiping who was pretending to be the successor of Jesus, and he organized massive uprising of peasants under the idea that, of course, Jesus was on the side of the poor against the rich, and so on and so on. And it's important to take that into account because it was a peasant revolution against the monarchy, of course, but also against foreign imperialists. And it had some influence in the Hunan province, in which later Mao Zedong would come from. That's one aspect. The second aspect is that at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we cannot really say that Marxism was very popular in China. The Marxists were very, very few, and I would say people who wrote Marx were very, very few. And I would say that the progressive left in China was rather oriented toward anarchism. I would say that at the beginning of the 20th century, anarchists were more known in China than Karl Marx. And of course, it's not completely, let's say, because of spontaneity. It's because, of course, Chinese tradition is a tradition of peasant uprising from the very beginning of the history of China, and in a certain sense, we can say that the the Chinese peasant are naturally tending towards something like anarchism, rather than something like, let's say, proletarian revolution. So it's important to take all that into account, that the peasant aspect of the Chinese society explained two first layer, let's say, of the Chinese revolution, the typing, which is radical Christianity, and radical and specifically Chinese by certain aspects, and the second one is anarchist. So when the Communist Party of China was founded, this party was founded in this country, as I told you, which was sympathetic to Russian Revolution, mostly because of the anti-imperialist aspect of the Russian Revolution. But of course, we have to take into account that this party was not really a Marxist, not to talk about Leninist. It was superficially Marxist and Leninist, I would say. It was not really the case at the very beginning. And that's why the so-called 28 Bolshevik I told you about are important to understand the beginning of the history of Chinese Communist Party, because of course they went to Soviet Union, they were trained in Soviet Union in the 20s, and then went back to China as, let's say, true Soviet type Marxist-Leninist when they came back to China. Among them, the most important one is Wang Ming, a man who was strongly, of course, related to Soviet Union, who always tried to develop inside the Communist Party of China a Soviet line, a line linked with Soviet experience, with Soviet point of view, even, and we will see that he will be one of the leader of the party, especially he will be the general secretary of the party in 1931 and 1932, but even after he resigned from his position, his influence was important among his successors. And Wang Ming was competing, let's say, with, let's say, the peasant trend inside the party, which was more and more represented by Mao Zedong. For, let's say, biography, we have to take into account that Wang Ming at the very end went to Soviet Union when he lost power in China, in Communist Party of China. He went to Soviet Union, and he was always on the side of Soviet Union, especially after the split between Soviet Union and China in 1956, in 1960, he was fighting against Maoist China up to in his death in the 70s. So Wang Ming is the most symbolical, let's say, pro-Soviet liners in the Communist Party, and as we will see, he was in competing with the other line Mao Zedong did later represent. At the very beginning, Mao Zedong was not the main man in the representing that line, but after a certain time, Mao Zedong became, of course, the most important leader of the Communist Party. We have also to take into account that we had these 28 Bolsheviks coming from Soviet Union, and we had also relatively strong Chinese presence in France. Why? Because during the First World War, China was, of course, a completely colonized and not independent country, but the officially recognized government of China. I say the officially recognized government of China because, in fact, there was no real Chinese government because the country was split between warlords controlling different parts of the country. But there was something like an official Republic of China government recognized by foreign powers and especially by imperialist power. This China was not, of course, in a situation that it could take part in the First World War as a military power because China was completely ruined them. But China officially took the side of the Western imperialist powers. And to help, let's say, to fight against German imperialism, they decided to send in France, I would say, slaves, because officially it was workers, but they went in France in a situation which rather can be associated with slavery. So they were sent to France, and they worked in factories because, of course, French workers were soldiers on the front and Chinese workers were working in factories on, of course, very, very, very bad conditions. And this created, of course, among these Chinese workers, their first, let's say, rebellion. And this coexisted with the fact that at the beginning of the 20s arrived in France some, let's say, intellectuals, some children of rather middle class or upper middle class Chinese society who arrived in France to study. And of course, come back later to China. And among them, we had two very well-known later people. But of course, that's not the only one. We had Zhou Enlai, the future prime minister of China, and we had Deng Xiaoping, the later chief of the party, of the Communist Party. And these young students in Paris created a local communist organization because they very quickly became let's say, communist activists, and they managed to organize a strike among Chinese workers in France, and one of them, Deng Xiaoping, was even expelled from France due to the organization of strikes. So we had also this group. It is important because I told you about the 28 Bolsheviks coming back from Soviet Union, but we had also Chinese communists coming back from France who became communists in France under, let's say, the French, I would say, influence. So we had the Paris group and the, let's say, Moscow group. And we had, of course, communists who never left China, especially Mao Zedong, who was working inside the country and who was organizing, let's say, locally communist movement. And what happened, of course, is the fact that from 1927, when I told you the Chiang Kai-shek regime did strongly repress, horribly repressed communists, up to 1935, we had that moment when the communists, the Chinese communists, were divided. Of course, they were strongly repressed. Their organization was almost completely destroyed, and especially in towns. And in the same moment, Soviet Union, Soviet policy was trying to have good relation with the Chinese government, the Kuomintang's government, and pushing Chinese communists to cooperate with the Kuomintangs, who massacred a lot of communists. And this, of course, created a quite strong feeling that Soviet leadership doesn't understand the situation of China. Soviet leadership is promoting a political line corresponding to the state interests of Soviet Union, but which are in fact in contradiction with the interest of the Chinese revolutionaries and of the Chinese people. So we had at that time the beginning of a feeling inside the party, which I would not say anti-Soviet, but I would tell it was a feeling that Soviet Union, Comintern representatives in China do not understand what is the local situation, and do not promote a policy taking into account the interest of Chinese revolution, having, of course, their main interest in promoting interest that can bring Soviet Union to exist in a world where, of course, Soviet Union had almost everywhere enemies. And this we have to take, of course, into account. We have to take, for example, into account the fact that the son of Chiang Kai-shek, which was the right wing and the exterminationist of the communists, was, for example, sent to Moscow and made his study in Moscow. This is to show that Soviet Union at the beginning of the Stalin time was rather tending to promote a policy of alliance with what in Soviet Union could be considered as national bourgeoisie. But in fact, it happened to be the comprador bourgeoisie, because Chiang Kai-shek was mostly on the side of the imperialists, as we know from later experience. Anyway, this explains why the situation of the Communist Party began to evolve since, as I told you, almost all communists living in towns, and especially in Shanghai, were arrested, killed, tortured, and we can say that very few of them managed to survive in big towns where the Kuomintang's police was very strong. So most of the communists had to escape in the countryside, and in the countryside in different regions of China, but especially in the Hunan province, where Mao Zedong was coming from, there were regions where you had the formation of the Chinese Red Army. It means regions that were under communist administration, and that the Kuomintang government couldn't control. And this is especially the main Soviet, in Chinese sense, Soviet area in China was in the Hunan province, in the south center of China, where Mao Zedong was coming from and where he had quite strong links. And he was, in fact, the leader of the local, let's say, Soviet Republic of China, which existed there. But at the very end of its existence in 1935, the military pressure of Kuomintang was so strong that the leader of this republic decided to leave the area and to go to what will be called the Long March. It was about 10,000 kilometers. We have to say that the Long March was a very long march, because it was more or less 10,000 kilometers taking communists from South Central China through mountains, hills, forests, and of course in very harsh conditions, to the north of China, near Mongolia, where in Yan'an we had another red base, which was supposed to be more secure. And that's one aspect of the thing. And of course, when we talk about the Long March, we have to understand that it was a very tough Long March, because more or less 90% of the people who begin this Long March died during the march, and almost only 10% survived and arrived at Yan'an. That's the first thing. The second thing we have to take into account is that at the time I'm talking about, it means from 1932, Japanese aggression against China was more and more obvious. Of course, it began from the very beginning, after the end of the First World War, because as I told you, China officially took side of the victorious powers against Germany, and we could suppose logically that at the end of the war, at least China would recover the German city of Qingdao in the Shantung province, which was something like a German Hong Kong. You know, Hong Kong was the local colonial British base in China. We had another British base in Shanghai. We had a French base in Shanghai. We had the Portuguese in Macau, and we had a German one in northern China on the sea. So, and what is very important to understand is that Japan was also allied with Americans, with French and English against Germany in the First World War. And at the end of the First World War, the former German base in China was not given back to Chinese, but to Japan. So for the Chinese, it was something like a terrible shock, because officially they were on the side of the victorious power. They sent slaves to Europe to help the victory, and even they couldn't take back the only city which was under German hand in their own country, and it was given to Japan. So the Japanese imperialists became at that time the symbol of the most imperialist aggression against China. And when Japanese occupied northeast China, which is often called Manchuria, then there was a very complicated situation in China, because the so-called nationalist party, the Kuomintang, the Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, was fighting against communists at that time. And a lot of Chinese, not communists, began to think that it was completely unacceptable to have a Chinese government concentrating war effort on internal enemies, communists, but not fighting against the foreign aggression of the Japanese imperialists. And the Long March I told you about earlier was in this purpose a very strategical and very intelligent, it appeared, of course, decision from the Chinese communists, because leaving South Central China and going to northern China, they managed to arrive in a region where they were not far from Japanese occupied territories. So they could easily then present themselves as the real Chinese patriots, fighting against Japan, because the official Chinese government is a bunch of traitors who do not want to fight against the foreign occupation. So, of course, it's very important because then the Communist Party became not only the party of the working class, as I told you earlier, but the party of the national liberation against the so-called nationalists, which were not so nationalist as they pretended to be. And that's, of course, one very important point. The second point, of course, is that the Soviet China I told you about, the Soviet base, I would say, of China, were, of course, based in rural areas. And de facto, the main line of the Communist Party from the very beginning was becoming unrealistic on the ground, because the concentration of the party's effort in towns and among workers were defeated, and in the same time the leadership of the party, which was in cities, was obliged to leave towns and take refuge in a rural peasant area. And this situation, of course, explains why progressively the, let's say, pro-peasant fraction in the Communist Party began to take advantage in a factual way. I mean, concretely, of course, the Communist Party of China was becoming a more and more peasant party and a less and less proportionally working class party or workers' party, that's for sure, sociologically speaking. But of course, in the same time, some communist leaders, of course, the one we know about is Mao Zedong, but he was not the only one at that time, began to develop a theory and analysis of the class structure of China, in which the peasants were taken into account as a base for the revolutionary movement, even if, of course, nobody did declare that the workers were unimportant, but that in the specific Chinese conditions, the peasant has the main role to play, even if ideologically the Communist Party still is the party of the working class. And that explained why it happened in 1935, a very important moment in the history of the Communist Party of China. It means in 1935, when the Red Army, the Chinese Red Army, left its base in the Hunan, going to the Long March in the direction of Yan'an, they had a conference on the road, I would say, in the city, the little city of Zunyi. They managed to conquer this city, organize their meeting, and of course then left for the northern part of China toward Yan'an. But in Zunyi there was a very, very important, I would say, it's the second foundation of the Communist Party. The first one was, of course, in 1921. The second one was in Zunyi in 1935, because in 1935 we had at this conference a complete refundation of the program of the party, taking into account two things: the necessity of the party to be in the forefront of the fight against Japanese imperialism. That's the first point, and to ask all Chinese, independently of what they did earlier, including then even Kuomintang members who killed communists earlier, to join with the communists in a united front against Japanese imperialism. That was the first important decision. And the second decision was that the peasant had not to be considered as a, let's say, a reactionary archaic class, but as a revolutionary class, along with the working class, and that communists should promote radical reforms in the countryside, so to have the peasants on their side for national liberation and for social emancipation. And we can say that from the and what is important is that, of course, Mao Zedong then played a strong role in the Zuni conference, but also some students coming back from Paris, like Chu Enlai, and three of the so-called 28 Bolsheviks and coming from Moscow took side on with Mao Zedong and forced the idea I told you about. It means, to a certain extent, they criticized the Comintern policy that was advocating revolution in the cities, that was advocating alliance with the Chinese government of the Kuomintang, and not taking into account the necessity of carrying a grassroots war of national liberation. And in 1935, one of the 28 Bolsheviks I told you about was chosen general secretary of the party. Chang Wen-tian was a general secretary of the party from 1935 to 1943. And it was something like a compromise, because he was general secretary of the party. He was from this group of the 28 Bolshevik, but he was a split from the group of the 28 Bolshevik because he took side of the side of let's say peasant revolutionaries under Mao Zedong. But in fact, we can say that Mao Zedong was the real leader of the party. Even if he had not the official position of the first man of the party. The idea to have Chang Wen-tian as general secretary was, of course, a compromise. First of all, because he was one of the 28th Bolshevik. He was linked with Moscow, he was linked with the Comintern, and pushing him on the forefront was something like a compromise to have good relation with Moscow, and in the same time to promote the, let's say, peasant national liberation line of Mao Zedong. But we can say that, in fact, Mao Zedong became the first man of the Communist Party in 1935, even if officially Mao Zedong will be the leader of the Communist Party only in 1943, so 8 years later. In fact, Mao Zedong, we can say that from the Zuni conference of 1935, was the main leader of the Communist Party. What we have to take also into account is that when I say that he was the main leader of the party, he was not the Communist Party of China all over the time, but even in the 50s and the 60s, when the prestige of Mao Zedong was very strong, we have to take into account that always the Communist Party of China was a collective direction. And we have a huge proportion of very, let's say, very strong leaders with very strong opinions, with very good political educations. And what is characteristic of the Communist Party of China is that this party produced a lot of very, very let's say, not only intelligent, but very educated, politically educated leaders. You know, Chu Enlai, Chu Te, Deng Xiaoping, and a lot of different people in the party were very, very prominent, I would say, people, having their own opinions. And what is characteristic of the Communist Party is, on one side, its discipline, which is a, let's say, Bolshevik type of discipline, but also a very vivid party with very strong contradictions, which most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, were solved by the way of strong political campaigns, debates, and decision with discipline. What is important to understand is, and we will have that all over the history of the Communist Party of China, as in Soviet Union, as in the Soviet Party, we had strong internal tensions. And as you know, we had Trotsky, we had Bukharin, we had Kamenev, we had Stalin, we had Khrushchev, and so on and so on. And the whole history of the Soviet Communist Party is also a history of different leaders fighting one with the other because they had different political lines, ideological views, and so on. And that's important to say because in the Western propaganda, we have always the impression that when leaders are fighting against each other, it's because they want to have power and they are fighting for their own career. Most of the time, it's not the case. Most of the time, they represent a social base. They represent a class orientation, and these class orientations are competing, and of course, individuals are taking side on this side or on the other side. And that's, of course, the history, among others, of the Soviet Communist Party. We had the same thing in China. Because as I told you, for example, the question, what is the role of the peasantry, is a pure political question. It's not a question that Mao was a pro-peasant and then that Wang Ming was rather a pro-worker man, but because there was class contradiction inside the Communist Party. Of course, class contradiction between peasants and workers are not the same than class contradiction between working classes and bourgeoisie. The main problem with Chinese communists was always, and up to today, is to decide whether national bourgeoisie is a progressive class different from the comprador pro-imperialist bourgeoisie, or national bourgeoisie is a bourgeoisie and is a class enemy. That's one question, of course, which is very important for China and all, let's say, colonial countries where you had a bourgeoisie competing with imperialist powers. And if we take that into account, the specificity of the Chinese Communist Party is that most of the time, not always, but most of the time, Chinese communists were competing and were having different views, different opinions, but they were leading mostly an ideological fight. And at the very end, of a long political campaign, at the very end, the decision was taken, and then the minority has to accept the decision of the majority. And this is why most of leaders who competed with, let's say, Mao Zedong in the history of the Communist Party, some of them left the parties, but the majority stayed in the party, and even sometimes they were repressed, but they were never killed. And that's why, for example, we have Deng Xiaoping, who take the power after the end, the death of Mao, because he was not killed. He was expelled from the direction of the party. He was sent to the countryside, but he was not killed, so he could come back. And that's one very important aspect of the Chinese communist movement. And we had the same on the other side. For example, after the end of the Cultural Revolution, as we know, Mao's wife, who was one of the leaders of the Cultural Revolution, Jiang Qing, was arrested, was put in trial, but she was not killed. she was not. She ended. She ended her life by suicide because she decided to suicide to protest against the Tiananmen events. But anyway, it was her own decision. She was not killed, even if she was decreed an enemy of the party line after 1976. So that's one important aspect. I would not say that all tensions we had in the Communist Party finished in a way that there was no physical repression, but most of the time Chinese communists preferred to organize political campaigns against the line they were fighting against inside the party, but they were not promoting let's say, anti-individual campaigns against the people representing the orientation they were fighting for. But all what I told is important to understand, because we must understand that the whole history of the Communist Party is a history where you have different lines opposed to other lines, concerning internal question, concerning class questions, or concerning international issues, concerning imperialism and so on. So from 1935, we can say that Mao Zedong was the leading man of the Communist Party, but of course he was a leading man inside a very ideologically strong party. Of course, Mao Zedong wrote a lot of theoretical articles, a lot of books, a lot of poems, because he was also a poet, what we don't really know in the Western world. But he was not the only one. If you examine the history of the Communist Party of China, including the opponents of Mao Zedong like Wang Ming and other people, all of them were very, very theoretically prepared, and all of them wrote a lot of articles of theoretical work, competing one with the others, but always on a very, I would say, intellectual high level. I mean, the Communist Party of China is a party that produced a huge amount of very strong theoreticians of a lot of ideological works. And it's a very, very rich party. Of course, we know, most of us know Mao Zedong writings, because he's the one who took the first place in the history of the Communist Party, that's for sure. And of course, Mao Zedong is a strong philosopher and his strong ideologies, that's for sure. But he was not the only one. And the people who were not agreeing with him had also very strong arguments and very strong thought. And of course, most of them are today forgotten, especially in the Western world. In China, they are much more known, of course, and depending on the line of the party and the evolution of the party, some of them are promoted or not by now. But of course, we have to take into account that let's say the Communist Party of China was a very, very strong people's university. It was not only a political organization, it was not only the leader of a military organization, because the party had an army, the Red Army, and which will change name later on People's Liberation Army. But the Communist Party had a very strong ideological experience and a very strong ideological history, which is very, very interesting, because of course, the Chinese communist movement had always to manage to unify Marxism, which is, of course, coming from the West in China, with, let's say, not only Chinese traditions, but Chinese concrete social situation. And that's why, if you read Mao Zedong, but you will find it in other prominent communists or thinkers or sympathizer of communists in China, you will always find quotations from, of course, Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and so on. But you will find also quotations from traditional Chinese thinkers, traditional Chinese philosophers, and the mixture of the two create the Chinese, let's say, what we call the Mao Zedong thought is not only the idea coming from the man Mao Zedong, but it's a synthesis of a lot of opinion that circulated among Chinese communists, linked with Marxism and linked with the Chinese tradition, and taking into account also the huge history of peasant uprising all over the Chinese history. Because what is characteristic of Chinese history is that, of course, it's the oldest existing state in the world. But it's, of course, a state which was dominated by several dynasties. But most of the dynasties we had in China were always dynasties coming from peasant uprisings. You had peasant uprising, then a peasant arrived, create a new dynasty, and little by little, the peasant dynasty became more and more aristocratic, less and less peasant, and then you have a new peasant uprising, and a new dynasty, and so on and so on. And that's very important, because if we want to understand the Chinese communist movement, it's to a certain extent the same and not the same. It's not the same because, of course, communist movement is based on Marxism-Leninism, which is coming from outside China. That's for sure. Communist Party is based on the fact that China was becoming a modern country, very exploited at the end of 19th century, but still tending to the modernity of capitalism. And of course, the Communist Party was the product of this situation of a modernizing China, of a new Chinese society appearing in the towns, in factories, in bourgeoisie, in proletariat, and so on. And that's for sure. But on the other side, we have also always a country which is mostly rural and peasant, in which peasant traditions are very strong. And when we understand that, we understand why, for example, Mao Zedong, we can, of course, think what we want about the so-called Great Leap Forward at the end of the 50s, or about the Cultural Revolution in 1966. It's, of course, a very complicated subject, and maybe it's not the time here to talk about. But we have also to take into account that these events were very important because they were rooted in the Chinese tradition. The Chinese tradition is what? It's that the people, the peasant, make uprising, and sooner or later, the new emperor betray its peasant and become more and more authoritarian, more and more isolated from the uprisers. And the main ambition of the Chinese communists, not only Mao Zedong, was that this time the revolution should not become revisionistic and not betray the masses, as it was always the case in the whole Chinese history from the very beginning of the state. So when we take that into account, we understand why the Chinese communists, who were not really fanatically, I would say, Stalinist, because as I told you, Chinese communists had a quite strong difference with Stalin's Soviet Union at the end of the 20s and especially in the 30s. But in spite of that, in spite of these differences, in spite of the fact that they were criticizing Stalin on this or that point, they always understood that basically Stalin was the man building socialism in Soviet Union. So when Khrushchev appeared, they saw very, very, very early that Khrushchev was the man betraying revolution. Whatever they thought about Stalin, the official point of view of Mao Zedong, but it's always the same point of view of the Chinese Communist Party now, is that Stalin was good in 70% and bad in 30%. That's the official point of view of the Chinese Communist Party. Stalin good 70%, bad 30%. So basically he is good because he's 70% good, ideologically, politically, historically, and so on. But if you understand why they were so anti-Khrushchev, it was basically we can say because of, let's say, a Soviet hegemonic comportment toward China, but it was not only that, because they saw in Khrushchev the same, let's say, emperors coming from peasants in China who step by step began to betray peasants and become aristocratic dynasty. So this is very important because it makes us understand why the obsession, I would say, not only Mao Zedong, but of most communists after the 1949 liberation of the country was that this time the Chinese uprising must succeed. It means that we will not create a new aristocracy out of the uprising. We will try to behave the mass line. And one of the basic expression of the Chinese Communist Party is the mass line. The mass line is the basic ideological word for the party. It means the party cannot exist for itself. The party is supposed to be and has to concentrate on the fact that it has to be along the mass line. It means it has to be the party of the masses. It has to be linked with the masses. It has to observe what the masses are thinking. It has to serve the masses, and so on and so on. Not to repeat this tradition of Chinese uprising, who are betrayed by the ones who took power with the peasants, and then repressing the peasants after they have taken power. And that's very important. That's why the Communist Party of China, up till now, considers Stalin as a revolutionary and Khrushchev as a counter-revolutionary. Because even if now, after the market reform in China, we can say that China is, to a large extent, becoming a partly at least capitalist country, which is the fact and which is officially recognized by Chinese communists, even if they pretend that China is still going toward socialism. It's of course a question we have to debate about. But anyway, basically, the official line of the Communist Party is always to recognize that whatever you can criticize Stalin was a revolutionary. Khrushchev betrayed the mass line in Soviet Union, and that the Communist Party of China, even when he allows capitalists to create their own enterprise, to exploit workers, and so on and so on, the Communist Party has still to be on the mass line and has to let's say, control capitalists so they don't take power and they don't corrupt the communist leaders, and then don't corrupt the Communist Party members. That's very important. Of course, now we can discuss if it was a success, part success, not success, and everything. But we have to understand, of course, this ideological line, because if we don't understand this ideological line, we don't understand the history of the Communist Party of China. We don't understand the Mao Zedong era in China from 1949 up to 1976. But we don't understand also the Deng Xiaoping lines after 1976 up to Xi Jinping, taking into account that Xi Jinping is the third stage of the history of the Communist Party, which is also a very interesting stage, but of course it's only recent and it's difficult to have the distance to qualify the Xi Jinping's line as we can do with the Deng Xiaoping's one or the Mao Zedong's one. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you have some question.
I have a lot of questions because you said a lot of things.
5 hours or 7 hours?
Okay. So first question, do you know some information about the Deng Xiaoping who was in Paris? Because it was interesting me. Maybe I will go there. I will make some reportage. There are a monument or stuff like this.
I don't know exactly, but I have a friend, Jean-Pierre Page, who was the leader of the foreign department of the CGT, the trade union CGT, and he managed. When he was at that position, he managed to find in the French police archive the documents of the French police expelling Deng Xiaoping, and he took the document and with him and took it to Peking and gave them to the Communist Party of China. So maybe I have to ask him how we find that document first, and for sure, exactly. I know that Deng Xiaoping was working in a factory in what is now Val-de-Marne, 94.
Nice.
South of
à côté de chez moi.
Yes, and he was in one of these fabrics. I don't know which one, but anyway, he was organizing strike there. And I don't know if in this factory there is a maybe not a monument, but at least something remembering. I guess the Chinese embassy did that. I know that they also organized something where Chuenlai, because Chuenlai also was the former prime minister of China, very important man in the Chinese history. Even some people say he was more important than Mao Zedong, in fact, maybe. Anyway, it's a question we can debate on, but Chuenlai was one of the most important Chinese leaders in the 20th century for sure. And he was with Deng Xiaoping, but I think in another factory. I think we can find it. We can find that. It's just a question to. I never think about that, but I can ask and try to find where it is. And of course, it would be pleasant to have photos, because it's the history of France and China.
Okay, so now I would like to ask you about your opinion why Communist Party of China was so huge, because we know that there are many people who lived in China, but if we divide the numbers of the people who lived in China and to 92 million, it's all the time a very big number of the members of the party. So could you give your opinion why Communist Party of China was growing so fast, and for example why Communist Party of Poland in 1920s and 30s are stayed like this small party? What was in your opinion the biggest difference which make the success of Chinese communists?
I think that there are a lot of elements, but basically, as I told you, Chinese were already in a revolutionary time from 1911. So China was in revolution when the Chinese Communist Party arrived. So he arrived in a society which already did the revolution, expelled monarchy. Of course, this revolution was not successful in this sense that it didn't create a new regime able to build a new China. But still, it was a victorious revolution because it ended the monarchy that was in China from from 4,000 years. So it was a huge revolution, and the Communist Party fit in that. That was the first thing. The revolution was in 1911. You had in May 1919. A very huge mass and especially university movement after the First World War, when China discovered that the effort the Chinese government did on the side of the imperialists were ignored by imperialists because they gave the former German city to the Japanese. There was a huge movement, an intellectual movement against traitors, against imperialists, and against the old Chinese culture. It means that in 1919, a lot of Chinese intellectuals began to understand that, of course, the old Chinese culture is very rich, but it is completely out of the time. And that if China has to be liberated, it has to be along a new culture. And that's why a Chinese revolution, even before 1966, was also a cultural revolution. It was not only a political or a social revolution, it was a cultural revolution. It reshaped the whole Chinese culture, the language, the alphabets, the way of thinking. And inside that, the communists managed to be in the vanguard of that not only political trend, but cultural trend. From the very beginning of the Chinese Communist Party, they were really aware that their fight must not only be a political fight or a military fight, which they carried on, but must be a cultural fight, an artistic fight. New art, new culture, new literature, and of course linked with the peasants, linked with the masses, and cutting ties with all the aristocracy and elite and so on. And this was very important because it make Chinese people look at the communists as true revolutionaries in a revolutionary already society, as true patriots, because it was the only ones who really fought against imperialists, Japanese imperialists especially, but not only, against all imperialists, who was the only party who was, even when the Soviet Union tried to have contact with Chiang Kai-shek, it was the only party really linked with the idea that Soviet Union was the beginning of a new world and the only ally of the Chinese people. And that's very important because, it make Chinese understand that you can have quarrel with somebody, but if it's your comrade, it's still your comrade. So communists were not agreeing with Soviet Union on every point, but it was their comrades, and it stayed their comrades. And that's very important because it created inside the Chinese society the idea that we have in front of us an organization of people dedicated to an idea and able to, let's say, bypass their own ego, their own subjective way of thinking, because they have strategical view. And of course, what made the Communist Party very popular, it's its role during the Second World War, because in 1937 they forced Chiang Kai-shek to accept the alliance against the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek, who killed massively killed communists. The communists forced him to cooperate with them, and they didn't look for revenge. They looked for national liberation. And during the Japanese war, from 1937 up to 1945, China was in war with Japan. And we have to take into account that the Chinese-Japanese war, it was 25 million deaths. When we think about Soviet Union, we know that there was 27 million deaths in Soviet Union during the Second World War. But we forget sometimes that almost in China we had the same amount of people killed during Japanese occupation. So Japanese occupation was a very, very, very strong occupation. And in spite of the fact that officially we had the United Front of communists and Kuomintangs against the Japanese, in fact, the main role in fighting Japanese occupation was due to the communists, because they were in northern China, near the Japanese lines, and they were, of course, much more active, creating a partisan group and so on, and creating red base. And in this red base, they created education system, health system, and artistic events, and all that gained, the approval of a lot of Chinese. I would not say that in 1949 the majority of the Chinese were in favor of the Communist Party, but they were in the sense that they were not communist. But I say, it's obvious that in 1948 the majority of the Chinese people looked at communists as true patriots, as people not corrupted. In a country that was under imperialist power, in a country that was plundered by imperialists, in a country that was completely corrupt, and the communists look like pure people. And this was the reason why communists are still very popular in China. You had a 10-year Harvard University inquiry in China. You cannot say that Harvard sociologists are communists. And the Harvard University organized this inquiry in all over China, sociological inquiry, and the result is that 93% of inquired Chinese are in favor of the Communist Party. 93%. I mean, it's not a vote. It's a sociological inquiry made by an imperialist country inside China. And you understand now why United States are so anti-Chinese now, because they know that Chinese people is with their government in most of the line. It doesn't mean that you have no quarrel in China. If you look at Chinese media, you see very strong polemics on what is to be done, what is not to be done, what is socialist, what is anti-socialist, what is the place of the private sector, what is not, and so on. So China is a country where the political rivalries, where political tendencies are competing one with the other. But still, they are almost all on the base that it has to be solved within the Communist Party, and not outside or not in opposition to the Communist Party. That's why the only place in China they can find ally, it's in Hong Kong. It's the only place. I mean, they push Hong Kong because they cannot find, the imperialists cannot find nobody important in Peking, in Shanghai, or in Xinjiang. They have emigres, and they have Hong Kong, because of course Hong Kong was brainwashed during 100 years of British colonial power.
Wrócę za 10 sekund. Okay, I am back. So now I would like to ask you about socialism in the propaganda of the Communist Party in 1920s and 1930s. In the newspapers or articles, or I don't know, all this propaganda of Communist Party, when they speak with the people, they said that they fight for what? Because all these things which...
Basically, they fought for two things: national liberation against imperialists, and especially against Japanese imperialists, but not only. And it has to be, of course, taken into account, because everywhere in China, you found foreign, very expensive products. And you had a complete corruption. So every Chinese was aware, the most illiterate Chinese in a deep province of China was aware that China was plundered by imperialists, that China was before a very important civilization. In 17th century, China was how do you say, the revenue per capita of China was the highest in the world in 17th century. And in one century, China fell to one of the poorest countries in the world under colonial influence. So every Chinese was very aware that China was plundered by imperialism. That's one aspect, very clear. So it was not very difficult for communists to explain to a Chinese peasant that his country has to be liberated. And that a national government should plan an economy for the development of Chinese people and of Chinese peasant and working classes. That was one very important element. And of course, the second element was agrarian reform. It means the end of the landlords and the land for the peasants. And that's quite interesting, because even if now China is a country where you have the private property, not the private property, the property of land is state, but a state is giving land to exploitation for individual workers. But in spite of that, in the 50s, when the peasants had their land after the land reform, the movement tending to create what was called the People's Commune came from grassroots China. It was not the collectivization as in Soviet Union that was planned in Moscow. The idea of People's Commune didn't come from Beijing. The ideas of People's Commune came from different regions of China, remote region, poor region, peripheral region. And the idea of collectivism was then quite strong in Chinese Communist Party, in Chinese society, before, I would say, communism. It's a characteristic we find not only in China. We find that characteristic in Eastern Asia, in socialist countries, of course, of Eastern Asia, North Korea, China, Vietnam. But we find it also in South Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan. The idea that collectivism is superior to individualism is an Asian tradition, which didn't wait for communists to be taken into account. And on this side, we have to acknowledge that the American imperialists were not so stupid after the Second World War, because if, of course, they created a pro-American Japan, a pro-American South Korea, a pro-American Taiwan, they let the local leaders create a type of capitalism which is much more collectivistic than the, let's say, neoliberal or liberal capitalism of the West. Because they understood that if they want to compete with communists in Taiwan, in Korea, in Japan, they must at least accept some aspects of collectivism, so to be able to compete with communism. On that very point, the American imperialists in Asia were not so stupid. They were quite clever, even if it doesn't please us. We have to recognize that the society they let Japanese, South Koreans, and Taiwanese build was much more adapted to local conditions than the one they didn't let, let's say, Latin Americans to build. Because, of course, East Asian traditions are collectivistic. And the idea that the individual must submit to a collective discipline is something that has very strong root taking back from, I would say, Confucian times.
But in the time of 1920s and 1930s, when they speak about anti-imperialism and agrarian reform, but do they speak about the liquidation of private property, about the liquidation of the bourgeoisie, about socialism?
The main problem the main issue of communists was that in the national liberation movement, you had to take into account all classes attempting to liberate their country from foreign plundering. It means, of course, peasants. It means, of course, workers. But it means also what is called in Mao Zedong, let's say, for example, papers, the national bourgeoisie. According to communists, in colonial countries, you have two bourgeoisie. The national bourgeoisie and the comprador bourgeoisie. The comprador bourgeoisie is linked with foreign interests, and it's supporting foreign imperialist domination, as we could observe in Chiang Kai-shek's China or in South Vietnam regime during the Vietnam War, and so on and so on. And you have that all over the Third World, the post-colonial Third World. And against this bourgeoisie, you have the national bourgeoisie, which would like to develop their own private enterprises, but who cannot, not because of communists, but because of competition with the big imperialist enterprises, capitalist and imperialist enterprises. And the idea was that revolution in China must take into account the fact that the national bourgeoisie can be on the side of the people against imperialism. That's one thing. The second thing was that in a backward country like China, the communists have, of course, as the ultimate goal to create a socialist, collectivized, and even communist society. But in the same time, they have to realize the objective of capitalism. It means the development of productive forces. In the Western countries, productive forces are already developed. So, of course, in Western countries, communists should fight for socialism. But in backward countries, they have to realize the objective of the capitalism and in the same time the ones of the socialism. And that's the main problem, I would say, communists had in the third world, but especially in China. What is the main goal of communists at the time we are now? It means, do we have to realize first the development of productive forces, including capitalists, patriotic capitalists, anti-imperialist capitalists, but still capitalists, or do we have to already go to socialism? And if you look at the Chinese experience before 1949 in the liberated areas, or after 1949 when the People's Republic of China was proclaimed, you see that all the time you have a competition with these two. Sometimes the party line is more left and remembering that the main goal is socialism. Sometimes is more right, let's say, and is telling that the main goal for the moment is the development of productive forces, and then later socialism. And that's the main problem. But I would say that these two points of view are competing one with the other. But these 2 points of view unify Chinese, because Chinese know that they have to carry on both track. The only question, which is a very important and difficult question, is which one you have to prefer, and that's of course difficult to decide, and that creates all the tension we had inside the Communist Party before People's Republic and after the creation of the People's Republic up to today. What is the position of the national bourgeoisie? Do we accept it as an ally? And if we accept it as an ally, then we have to accept it has part of the power, the economical power and the political power, because if it's an ally, you have to give them something. Or is it not an ally? And that's of course, and to which extent it's not an ally. If you have, let's say, a shopkeeper, is it an ally or not? Is he an ally or not? But if you have a private industry, is it the same than the shopkeeper or not? And so on and so on. And that's, of course, the problem. But for the majority of the Chinese people during the China-Japanese War, for example, the most important thing was national liberation. And they understood at that time that the question of socialism was not very important, was not the basic question. The basic question was give land to the peasant, give education to the peasant, and liberate the country from foreign power, and later begin the process of industrialization to make the country developed. Now China is not completely developed, but it's of course much more developed than it was. And now in China, you have competition between the idea, no, China is already developed, so maybe we can go further towards socialism. And some people say, no, it's not enough developed. We have still to use capitalists to develop a little bit more China, and socialism will come later. So, it's of course a class struggle we have inside China, and we have to be it has to be clear that we have a class struggle inside China and inside the Communist Party. The question, what Mao Zedong defined, and is the basic of the theory of Chinese Communist Party, is that inside a society like China, you have antagonistic class interest, and you have non-antagonistic contradictions. And the whole question, which theoretically is quite easy to understand, but practically very difficult to carry on, is where is the border between antagonistic class contradictions and non-antagonistic class contradictions, but still contradictions. And that's quite a lot of problems.
So I would ask you about the universalization of the Maoist conception of the revolution, because in our conversation here, many times we spoke about the national liberation. What about the countries which are not occupied by the foreign state? For example, we have the Maoist movement in India, Maoist movement in Philippines, which are not in the situation which were China before that. China was occupied by the imperialist countries, and in the 1930s they started war, very cruel, very war which make more than 20 million of the victims. And this occupation of China was something which made the Communist Party very strong, like the first force fighting for the national liberation. But now we have in the communist movement which exists today, there are the people who said that firstly there was the Marx and Engels. After Marxism, in the time of imperialism, it is Leninism. After it is in the time of building socialism, it is Stalin. And after we have new steps of the Marxism, it is Maoism. That Maoism is the Marxism in the epoch today. And for me, it is something strange. And I try to understand if there is something universal in the Maoist conception of the revolution, because apart of China, there are many Maoist movements, but they are, I don't know, this war in Philippines is 50 years or more and not success in India also. So
yes, but we have to take into account what is Maoism today, because you have, I would say, two Maoism. You have the, let's say, traditional Maoism, which is the Maoism before the Chinese reforms of 1978, and you have the post-Maoism of the Deng Xiaoping's China. And Maoist movement, I mean, political communist movement linked with Chinese communists are different, because the, let's say, hardline Maoists now in Philippines, in India, as you told you, and in a lot of other countries, are considering China, actual China, the Chinese People's Republic existing now, as a revisionistic country. So according to them, Chinese communists, real Chinese communists, have to make a revolution in China, or a new cultural revolution in China, to kick the bourgeois rulers inside the party. And outside China, of course, they had to carry on a revolution, taking into account the fact that most of Maoists are working in third world countries, which are under, as they consider, under neo-colonial rules. It means Philippines for them, India, Peru, or so on, are under a comprador bourgeoisie government, and has to be liberated from foreign domination, neo-colonial domination, and of course local class domination. That would, I would say, let's call them hardline Maoists. But and of course they are very different one from the other, and we have to take into account the differences, but basically more or less that line. And you have the communist parties which are from Maoist roots or not now, because some of the parties didn't took side on the Chinese side during the Soviet-Chinese split. China, the actual Communist Party of China, have link with party coming from Maoist roots, have contact with Communist Party that were on the China side, but didn't, for example, accept in 1965 the Cultural Revolution and split with China, and now took back relation with China, like, for example, the Communist Party of India Marxist, the main Communist Party of India, which was pro-Chinese before 1965, then had no link with China anymore, and now has again new links with China. And you have a Communist Party who were on the Soviet side of the split after 1956, and who now have contact with Chinese Communist Party. 1 month ago in May, you had an international reunion, a virtual international reunion of 58 Communist Party of the world, organized by the Communist Party of China, where you had let's say, for example, you had the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation is the party who was built in Russia after the fall of Soviet Union, but which is in the tradition of the Soviet Communist Party. And now it's a party linked with China. You had different parties. I will not tell you all the 58 parties who took part in this reunion. But what is, of course, very important is that the new Chinese leadership, the Xi Jinping, is tending now officially to rebuild the international communist movement. It doesn't mean that they want to recreate something like an international communist, but they are definitely wanting to create something like an international movement against the new Cold War and against imperialism. That was the two basic arguments of this reunion I'm talking you about. And of course, it shows something that the new Chinese direction is going more left than the earlier one. I would say that Xi Jinping, if you want to localize him ideologically, is something between Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong. And it's official. I mean, he told that we cannot celebrate the last 30 years of economical successes of China during Deng Xiaoping's line, neglecting the fact that the former 30 years were also very positive for the history of China. It means the Mao Zedong's era, and that both eras are positive, and that now we are in the third phase, third stage of socialism in China, and it's something in the middle of the road between the radical leftists of the first 30 years and the more right-wing, I would say, of the late 30 years. So now, when you talk about Maoism in the world, it's difficult to define exactly what we are talking about, because some Maoist party are against China. I mean, Chinese Communist Party direction. Some Maoists are with Chinese Communist Party, and Communist Party not having any root with Maoism are now cooperating with China, with Chinese Communist Party. It's difficult, to say that Zyuganov, for example, the leader of the Russian Communist Party, is a Maoist. Of course, now in Russia, in the Communist Party of Russia, they study Mao Zedong's works. But if you, I don't know, if you study, if you read Mao Zedong, does it mean that you are a Maoist? I don't know. It has no real sense anyway to use this word Maoism. Because of course Mao Zedong belongs to the history of the world communist movement. That's obvious. The Cuban Communist Party is linked with the Chinese Communist Party. They have very good relations. Do Cuban communists are Maoists? They were not. Now are they? I don't know. But they cooperate and they study.
No, but I am. You said that there are hardline Maoists, and there are these hardline Maoists. They said that today China is this revisionist.
Yeah,
so I don't want talking about revisionists. I am interested about this hardline Maoist because there exist also in Poland some people who attacked me that I am revisionist, that I don't know, Dengist.
Whatever. Yeah.
Yes. So I am interested about this hardline Maoist. And in your opinion, what is the chance, the possibility of building the revolution in imperialist countries like European or United States, in the NATO countries? What is chance today to building Maoist movement, Maoist parties in this line of hardline revolutionary anti-revisionist?
I think it's pure theory. I mean, it's completely intellectual. You have one example in Western world of a Maoist party who succeeded to be a relatively strong party is the Workers' Party of Belgium. It's a party which was up to recently 100% Maoist, but who always considered China after Deng Xiaoping as still a socialist country. So this Belgian party was all the time celebrating Stalin and Mao, and it became a strong party. Now it's one of the biggest leftist party in Western Europe, for a little country, but proportionally.
Yes, but I heard about this party that 15 years ago they make a purge, and all these hard lines were, I don't know, now these new people who...
The question about which was who was creating this split in the party was not linked with China, Stalin and Mao Zedong. It was linked with the question how to manage the question of Islam in Belgium and the relation toward working class linked with Islam. Do we recognize them as proletarian brothers fighting for socialism in spite of the fact they are not true Marxists but Muslims, but they are third world people exploited and so on and so on? Or do we go on a more, let's say, secularized line? That was the reason of the split. It was not linked with Stalin, Mao, and so on. But what changed now is that officially the Workers' Party of Belgium didn't change his position concerning Stalin and Mao Zedong. But we can take into account the fact that it is not really clear now. They don't put Mao Zedong posters or Stalin posters in front of their manifestation as they used to do 20 years ago. Some people of the party just tell it's a tactical change because people don't understand when you have posters of Stalin, what it means and so on. So it's useless to take them because it's just a question of tactic. But some people say that this party is going more and more social democratic which is, of course, in debate. I mean, I know that from outside. I'm not living in Belgium concretely, so I cannot tell you what is their real line in the everyday life. But my Belgian friends are talking me that you have these two interpretations. But anyway, we can say that this party succeeded as a strong party, being hardline Maoist on the theoretical line, even if it was linked with the new People's China, I would say, which is considered by a lot of Maoists as revisionistic.
Okay, last question, because it's very long now. Last question. What can you say about the women in the Maoist movement? Because in my opinion, when we saw this Maoist guerrilla movements in India, for example, there are many women, and also in the movies from the Cultural Revolution in 1960s in China, there are many women, and in opposite from the communists from Russia, from Eastern Europe countries, they are
that's
almost never any woman in the leadership in the. So is there any difference?
Yeah, that's very important, because you have to know, and that's a very important point what you are talking about, because of course, all over the world, as you know, the women were the most exploited group within the exploited classes. That's, of course, a very ancient story. But especially in China, the situation of the woman was particularly archaic before the revolution, and that's why the woman, the idea that women should be liberated was one of the main purpose of the Chinese revolutionaries, not only communists, but from the 1911 women were in the forefront of the fight for liberation, and this situation, of course, was very important, especially in the moment where let's say the revolutionary movements were very strong, like during the Second World War, the role of women in the fight for national liberation, or during the Cultural Revolution, as you told, and especially the role of the Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, was very important as a political actor, which was, and who was, what is important with her is the fact that she was a political leader, not because she was the wife of Mao Zedong, because she had her own political views and her own political argumentation, which was not the copy of her husband. She was a real political leader, autonomous, in spite of the fact that she was, of course, the wife of the main leader. But, of course, inside the Communist Party of China, you have also backward tendencies, and the role of women was not always so progressive as it was supposed to be. And the woman question is a real question. Inside the society, which is, of course, a society, a post-revolutionary society, but a society that has 1,000 years of patriarchal relation toward women, and of course, I would say the issue of women in Maoism was very important, but the issue of women in China is not completely solved. Of course, now we have much more women in China taking an active part in their life, social, political, economical life, but still, China is a country where, let's say, conservative way of looking at women is still quite strong. But you cannot do a revolution in one day, especially in the mentalities.
There is also the question from the chat. Jota Z asking, why did Lenin's initial plan, he sent Borodin and Blücher to spread communism in China, fall? Why did he overlook the role of Green Gang and their leader Chiang Kai-shek? Any comments about Jiang Qing, Mao's eventual fourth and final and famous wife, who had been an AMV, actress, model, whatever? Less generously, the W would stand for war, for the Green Gang. I know
Yeah,
what is
a lot
it
of
is.
questions.
It is. I think I found a YouTube channel. It is named ABC of Communism. It is the guy which make 100 100 lectures, and I started to speak about this channel, and I think this question is came from somebody who listened this chat, or Jason W. Smith, his name is, and because he said this, and I listened about this Green Gang 3 or 4 years ago in this ABC of Communism.
Yeah, but it's a lot of questions because you have now. First of all, of course, let's say Soviet communists were trained in the Russian society, and they didn't really understand what was happening in China. And it was, of course, for them maybe difficult to understand that Chiang Kai-shek was objectively on the side of the imperialists and not on the side of, let's say, national independence, sovereignty, and liberation. And that's why the Soviet leadership and Comintern made a lot of error analyzing situation in China. In the same time, preferring to observe what was happening in the cities, in factories, in the working class, not taking into account that 98% of the Chinese population was rural population. And all that makes us understand that Soviet Union couldn't really understand, not only in China, but in different countries of the world, the local situation. And that explained why at the very end, in 1943, Soviet leadership decided to dissolve the Communist International for different reasons, but among others because they understood that each country has its specificity, and to a certain extent, Chinese communists were the best example that you should understand the reality of a society, not giving them orders not linked with that. And in concerning this point, we can observe that in the 20s and the beginning of the 30s, the Soviet communists were pushing Chinese communists to behave in a way Soviet leadership could understand. But after the Tsuni conference I told you about, even if Moscow understood that the evolution of the Communist Party of China was not really the one they would have preferred, they accepted the new reality. And when Mao Zedong came to China in 1950, after the proclamation of the People's Republic, he stayed in Moscow very long, several weeks. And at the very end, Stalin told to Mao Zedong that he should print all his theoretical analyses because they are very useful for Marxist thinking. So to a certain extent, we can understand that Stalin understood that Mao Zedong was right, historically speaking, and that the Comintern has failed to understand what was going on in China and lost a lot of time and human life and energies in these policies. So that's quite important. The second aspect of the question was about, I think, I don't remember, but I think it was about Mao's wife, if I don't well understand, because it was the wife of some...
Yes, that she was a war.
She was a... Oh, that's a typical attack we had against her, because of course she was hated by the right wing in the communist parties for objective reason. I mean, she was standing on the radical left of the communist parties, and when she married Mao Zedong, the leadership of the party forced Mao Zedong to accept to accept the fact that she would never play any political role in China. And this was the case in the 50s. So she take her revenge in 1966 during the Cultural Revolution. And what is very important, because it shows that inside the Communist Party, you had the traditional, let's say, patriarchal, anti-female prejudice. Of course, you had that all over China, inside all of the Chinese society, but Chinese Communist Party is not outside the society, it functions inside this society. And as you know, everywhere in the world, when you have a very strong woman who is revolutionary, she is most always accused by the right, but sometimes by people from the left, to be a prostitute. I mean, you had exactly, for example, the same thing with Alexandra Kollontai in Russia and later Soviet Union. She was very independently thinking. She was a, let's say, autonomous revolutionary, and she was supposed to have a sexual obsession and to have misbehaviors, which were accepted when they were coming from men, but which are not accepted when they are coming from women. And you had that in Soviet Union. You had the same in China. And if you look at the way, for example, women were promoted in the Communist Party of China, you have two types of women, exactly as you had in Soviet Union. You have one type of woman who is promoted by, let's say, the more conservative wing of the party, who are promoting wives of. So let's say the wife of Liu Shaoqi, the wife of Chu Enlai, the wife of, are promoted by the right wing of the party, telling, oh, here you have a good woman, we are feminists because we are promoting her. But in fact, they are promoting her because she is the wife of. So the main image is the man and his wife. And you have, let's say, for example, it's not the only case, but of course the most well-known is Jiang Qing. Jiang Qing is the wife of Mao Zedong, but she's not promoted because she's the wife of Mao Zedong, because everybody observe that she is a pure independent political actor, that she is the wife of Mao Zedong, but she thinks by herself. She carries on decision by herself. Sometimes her husband accept her, sometimes not. It's a free couple of two free people that married, of course, but still that are autonomous. And of course, when you have a woman like Jiang Qing, whatever we think about what she did and what was her opinion, because she can be criticized for a lot of things and so on, but that's another thing. But she was not only criticized because of the decision she took, she was not only criticized because the opinion she had on this or that, which would be acceptable, but she was mostly criticized sometimes by some people because she was not behaving as the wife of. She was behaving as an independent political actor. And she was showing that a woman is a a comrade exactly on the same level as every comrade. You can criticize her politically, but you cannot consider her as the wife of. She is Jiang Qing. She's not the wife of. And this behavior is considered by conservative thinking people like something like a prostitute, because she has her own life. I don't talk about even sexual life. I don't know the sexual life of Jiang Qing. And I think that most people who talk about her don't know what was her sexual life. But the question is not what is important in his real sexual life. What is important is to understand that she's supposed to be sexually abnormal because she's independent. Of course, before she was married to Mao Zedong, she was not a virgin. That's for sure. She had a lot of men before. So what? So what? How many men had a woman before? How many men a woman Mao Zedong had before Jiang Qing?
I will say what was the context of this Jiang Qing. That in this lecture, this guy said that before Mao had another wife, which was also member of the Communist Party, and she was killed by the Chiang Kai-shek's army.
Yeah, that's
and she was for the people from the Communist Party, which fighting with Mao. She was something like saint. That it was a woman, wife of the leader, which was killed by our enemy, and for them. And in this time, when Mao and his comrades and his wife are making a fight with the Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jing in this time she was in city, and she was not fighting, and for them it was why you take somebody who is not with us from because I think that this critic was not that she was prostitute, that she is prostitute, but she is in the camp of the communists and she fight and have all these dangerous things with the fighting against. It is not problem, but in the time when it was very dangerous for communists, she had a life of. She don't make her life in danger, and after she came to the party, and she was the wife of the leader, and starting to say,
yeah, I know, but it's a caricatural view, because she was in Shanghai. Maybe she was not communist at that time. I don't really know, because it's not really clear. But anyway, she was in the artistic cultural front. Developing artistic trend, which were leftists basically. And later she went to Yan'an, the Red Base, which was not, it was not a holiday to go from Shanghai to Yan'an. It was very difficult to get through to the front lines to arrive to Yan'an. And when she arrived in Yan'an, she take part in the party activities and the resistance movement from 1937 up to 1949. So she was also in the communist fighting squad during the War of National Liberation against Japanese, and later against Chiang Kai-shek. So I think, of course, I don't know everything about her, and I know that quite a lot of things have been said against her. And it's very difficult to know what was the exact situation. But whatever we think is the fact that we can observe that first of all, if Mao took her as wife, she couldn't have been really, just an actress. I mean, because she collaborated politically with him from the very beginning. She was also going to Soviet Union for quite a long time because she had cancer, and she was in Soviet Union there for a health reason, and we know that she was politically active in Soviet Union at that time. So she. I think that we have her enemy developed a caricatural vision of her, maybe partly true, I don't know really, but it's not based about real sources. It's mostly based about prejudice, which I consider as rather, traditional, archaic, ultra-conservative, because she was a political leader. And, the way she behaved at her process, for example, at that time, she was, this process has to be finished with a death penalty. So the way she behaved shows that she is a real political leader, whatever you think about her. She had the courage to fight for political reason and not to submit to the power as others did in this process, for example. So it shows at least that she had some political ideas. You can accept or not, but you cannot deny she was a real political leader with a real political opinion and taking risk for that opinion. So I think that if she behaved like that in the 80s, she should have been like that all her life long. And what is told against her is, is exaggeration, mostly based on very, archaic views, because they cannot support a woman who is independent for her husband. And I think that Mao Zedong was in love with her because, so she was in love. She was in love with her. That's for sure. At least at the beginning of their marriage, especially because she was really independent in her thought, and he was a man looking for an independent woman, and not actresses submitting to the Lord.
Okay, she interests me when you compared her to Alexandra Kołłątaj. I think that I have to read more about her because it is interesting woman. I only to say that in these lectures, Jason W. Smith, ABC of Communism, in this YouTube channel, this guy, he make a lot of information, but there are many anecdotes like this. For example, when he speak about Drweski, 20 minutes he speak about his affair with Frida, and he is very likes speaking about these lectures, the Marxists, but when he can...
That's very funny in a certain sense, because in Marxism, we're supposed to have a scientific look at things, and personal and sexual things are private things we should not care about. As soon as there is no, let's say, rape, sexual behaviors of a man or a woman is not our things. We have not to take part to behave like petit bourgeois who are looking under the bed. What's happening between them? It's not our business. I mean, we are supposed to be free thinkers, and these questions are typically petit bourgeois questions. We are not petit bourgeois. We are not clericalists. We are not priests. But we behave sometimes. Some of our friends and comrades behave like if they were priests. That's not the purpose of revolution. The purpose of revolution is to create free people doing what they want as soon as they are doing it in the direction of revolution and not in the direction of counter-revolution. They can do whatever they want. I mean, I don't care to know if Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Chiang Ching, Kuomintang had one man in their bed, 10 men in their bed, 10 women in their bed, men and women in their bed, whatever they want. It's not our business. As soon as they don't rape them.
Yes, but he said that Trotsky was a guest of the president of Mexico, and in this time Mexico have a good relationship with Soviet Union, and
Yeah.
Trotsky, like a guest of the president of Mexico, was totally in the security because it was impossible that NKVD will kill him. But after his affair with Frida, Diego Rivera was very angry to Trotsky, and he said this of the president of Mexico, and President of Mexico said at Trotsky, "Okay, now you are alone. I take my bodyguards," and it is not the question that the bodyguards of the president of Mexico was very strong. It was the symbol that it is the private affair of Trotsky, and it was it is that now it was possible for the NKVD kill Trotsky because.
Yeah, that seems logical. I don't know this issue. That seems logical. And of course, I can understand why a man reacts like that against another man in this situation. That's purely private. But of course, when the man has power, he can do things he couldn't if he hasn't. And of course, it has some influence over history. Maybe Trotsky was killed because of that. Okay. And that's important on the historical point of view, because it's important, of course, the fact that Trotsky was killed. And that's historically important that he was killed. But we have not to take that on moral question. We have to take that as a historical fact. That's all. What I don't like is that very often inside the communist movement, inside so-called free thinkers movement, we just behave with a petit bourgeois priest morality. And that's what I don't, I mean, if we are creating a new world, you have to create a new man or woman that are not, under the archaic way of thinking about sex, sexual relation, and so on. We have to be outside that. And of course, sexual things are exploited on both sides, because sometimes you have, for example, the LGBT extreme movements. They are equally petit bourgeois as the priests who are against LGBT. They are obsessed by sexual questions, just not to talk about social ones. And that's the basic evidence. And concerning Chiang Ching, I don't care about her sexual life. I just take into account the fact that she was an autonomous political leader inside the Chinese Revolution. And I can agree with her or not, but I must recognize she was an autonomous political leader. She was not just the wife of the leader. And for me, that's interesting. And when I hear her discourse concerning women, for example, I know that she's talking by herself. She was not talking by Mao's point of view concerning women. She was talking like she was thinking about it. She had most obviously, she was in the artistic milieu in Shanghai, in the cinema milieu. So I guess she had a, let's say, normal sexual life inside that milieu. So what? So
Okay,
what? He was
could
not a
you?
revolutionary at that time. Maybe it has to be proven. So what?
Okay. Bruno, but could you say something about the sister of the Kim Jong-un? Because now she.
I don't know. I heard about her, but
No,
really,
no, because I heard, I think 2 weeks ago, I read in Gazeta Wyborcza that it was the decision which was made by Kim Jong-un. I don't know what decision, but she said that he announced something, and later she said that no, it will not. She's not agree with this, and they wanted to write in this article that now she is more important in the country than Kim Jong Un. Is true
I
or not?
wrote about that. I read about that. Excuse me. But I didn't really. I cannot say I know what happened. What I know is that about North Korea, we are always having different type of analysis inside the direction of the party, and we suppose that there is a fight between this and that and this and that. Maybe not. On which political ground would be the difference? I don't know. For sure, there are differences inside the North Korean direction. Possible that the sister of Kim Jong-un doesn't think exactly the same way as he's doing. That's possible. But, for the moment, I don't really know. And I think that Gazeta Wyborcza knows less than I do. So very less. So, but
Okay.
they are trying to it's very interesting when you have a quarrel inside the family. Because that's back to the anti-communism with petty bourgeois mentality. It's much more interesting when you have fight between the sister and the brother, or between the wife and the husband, than to see which are the political lines they are promoting against eventually the other one.
Yes, I agree with you that this. So thank you, Bruno, for this very long and very but it shows how many things you know about this subject. It is very.
No, but China was for me always an interesting subject, because I was raised in political life through Vietnam War and contact with Vietnamese and the Vietnam situation, and you cannot understand Vietnam War without taking into account the whole Asian revolutionary movements, including, of course, China.
One week ago, we published in our channel a short interview with Deng Xiaoping, like audiobook. It is 15 minutes. It is made in 1886, I think, in the time of Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And he is asked. He is asked about the speech which made Gorbachev in Vladivostok. And he is asked, what do you think about this speech? And in this speech, Gorbachev make a message to the Chinese Communist Party that I want to be friend with you now. And they ask, okay, do you want to be a friend with Gorbachev? And he said, yes, but there are 3 things which I am not agree. And one of these things is that Soviet Union has to stop make help to Vietnam, because Vietnam is our enemies. And
because Deng Xiaoping launched the war, not very long war, but the war between Vietnam and China. That's for sure. Everybody agrees with the fact that if Mao Zedong was at the time of the Chinese-Vietnam War, Mao Zedong wouldn't have attacked Vietnam. Anyway, China accepted the fact that it was an error. Even, of course, there were no self-critic of Deng Xiaoping, but to a certain extent there was, because at the end of Deng Xiaoping's rule, before he died, China renewed contact with Vietnamese party. So now the situation has changed, but of course we have to take into account this Vietnam-Chinese war, which is a very peculiar situation, since Chinese and Vietnamese parties were very, very, very close in the 60s, and situation deteriorated later, and especially, of course, at the end of the 70s.
Okay, but it is other conversation. So thank you one more time, Bruno, for this. I'll finish the broadcasting.